cavalry charge could destroy infantry in seconds, men caught in the open had almost no chance. Horses entered the gaps, sabers struck from above, and once a formation began to run, mounted troops could pursue it across the field. But an infantry square was different. The battalion turned outward in every direction. Bayonets faced the cavalry on every side. Loaded muskets waited behind them. At Waterloo, repeated French cavalry attacks rode against the Allied squares and failed to break them. That seems to answer the question. No, cavalry could not break a disciplined square. But 3 years earlier in Spain, German dragoons charged French infantry formed in square and forced their way inside. So the square was not unbreakable. The real question is this: what had to fail before cavalry could get in? The square removed the cavalry's greatest advantage. A long infantry line could be attacked from the side or from behind. But a square had no open flank. Every direction became a front. The outer ranks faced the cavalry with fixed bayonets. Behind them stood more soldiers with loaded muskets. But the common explanation that horses simply refused to approach bayonets is only part of the story. Cavalry could still circle the formation, threaten different faces, and force the infantry to react. If one side fired too early, the horsemen could return while the muskets were being reloaded. If one corner bent backward, the cavalry could concentrate against it. The square survived because the soldiers inside acted together. They had to hold their fire. They had to maintain their alignment. And above all, they had to believe that the men beside them would not move. The bayonets protected the square. But discipline made the bayonets matter. Waterloo revealed both the strength of the square and its hidden weakness. French cavalry repeatedly crossed the ridge and surrounded Wellington's infantry. The squares held their fire until the horsemen came close, then answered with volleys. The cavalry could not create a decisive opening, but the infantry was not safe. A square packed hundreds of men into a dense target. It moved slowly, and while it remained formed against cavalry, it became dangerously exposed to artillery. Round shot could pass through several ranks. Grape shot fired into the massed formation could break its order and create the opening cavalry needed. This placed the infantry inside a deadly choice. If the men abandoned the square and returned to line, the cavalry could charge. If they remained in square, the guns could continue firing into the crowded ranks. Cavalry did not always need to enter the square itself. It could hold the infantry in place while artillery weakened it. The square stopped the horses, but it could not stop the guns. On July 23, 1812, the theory failed at García Hernández in Spain. The French army was retreating after its defeat at Salamanca. Infantry formed square on rising ground as heavy dragoons of the King's German Legion approached. The French waited. Then they fired into the charge. Men and horses fell, but the dragoons continued forward. According to a later history of the King's German Legion, one mortally wounded horse and its rider crashed onto the French bayonets. For a moment, a gap appeared. The following dragoons did not hesitate. They forced their way through the opening before the infantry could close it. Once cavalry entered the formation, soldiers began turning inward. Files lost their alignment. The unbroken wall of muskets and bayonets disappeared. The square became a crowd, and a crowd surrounded by heavy cavalry had little chance. The success was extraordinary because several things had to happen almost at once. An accident created the opening. The infantry failed to close it, and the cavalry transformed one small breach into complete collapse. The dragoons had not overpowered a perfect square. They attacked at the exact moment it stopped being perfect. García Hernández became famous because breaking a completed square was extremely rare. Cavalry usually looked for an easier opportunity. The best moment came before the square was fully formed. At Albuera in 1811, British infantry from Colborne's brigade advanced against the French flank. The battalions were fighting in line when a sudden downpour began. Through the rain and battlefield, smoke came Polish lancers and French hussars. The cavalry struck the exposed flank before most of the infantry could form square. Within minutes, 3 battalions were overwhelmed. 1 battalion farther back managed to complete its square and avoided the fate of the others. The cavalry had not broken a prepared square. It had attacked before the square existed. That distinction explains many successful cavalry attacks against infantry. Rough ground could delay the formation. Smoke could hide the approaching horsemen. 1 battalion could block another. An officer might react a few seconds too late. The charge was often only the final blow. The real defeat began when the infantry lost the time and space required to form. So, could cavalry ever break an infantry square? Yes, but rarely by simply charging straight into a steady formation and forcing horses through an intact wall of bayonets. Usually, something had already begun to fail. Artillery opened a gap. The ground disrupted the alignment. The men fired too early. The square was still forming. Or one moment of panic convinced the soldiers that the formation had already been lost. At Waterloo, repeated cavalry attacks could not destroy the Allied squares. At García Hernández, one sudden opening allowed disciplined dragoons to force their way inside. At Albuera, cavalry succeeded because it attacked before most of the squares could be formed. That is the real answer. The infantry square was not an impenetrable fortress. It was an agreement between hundreds of frightened soldiers. No one would step backward, no one would turn, and no one would run. As long as they kept that agreement, cavalry faced muskets and bayonets in every direction. The moment they broke it, the square stopped being a square, and then the cavalry could get in. Thank you for watching.